What are the main words that come up when we think of the Victorians? Constricted, controlled, a time of high necklines, and angels in the house. These values were very much on the surface of Victorian society, and teenage girls got the brunt of this. These values were very much impressed upon them. So for example, from when they started puberty, they were not allowed to do strenuous exercise. That's where calisthenics came from, because it was gentle exercise that wasn't going to put a strain and destroy their reproductive systems, because that was a very real fear. And they were also allowed to go on long walks. Though of course, if you've read Sense and Sensibility, you will know that young women should not go out on walks in all temperaments, and that it can be incredibly dangerous for their fragile health if they do. The female body was just thought to be very weak. This image of women fainting all the time, largely due to the corsets and the lack of oxygen from all the candlelight. But one of the big things that was controlled was what these girls were allowed to read. Victorian society was predominantly a written culture. Neil Postman has written very persuasively on this, and the power of the written word is particularly explored in Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend, if that's something you want to learn more about. But one Mr. Bryce said, and I quote, "They are affected far more than young men are by the books they read. It is therefore a matter of the first importance to form their taste, to show them the books that are best worth reading." So the idea was girls' imaginations were more powerful than boys, and they were more susceptible to the things that they read in books, more impressionable. So as a result of this, as you can imagine, there were quite a lot of books that teenagers were not supposed to read, and today I'm going to be reading some of these books and kind of seeing what it was about them that made them so terrible that these 16, 17-year-olds were not allowed to read them. I'm really excited for today's readathon, and hopefully we both learn something new. Book 1, William Hazlitt. I have read some of William Hazlitt's essays before, and I was surprised to see that these were banned at Cheltenham School for Girls. In Kate Flint's wonderful book, The Woman Reader, she talks about how girls would smuggle Hazlitt, Kipling, Swinburne up to their bedrooms, and that's because these books were not stocked in the library and they were just like not allowed at school. So William Hazlitt is a very funny essayist and highly satirical. So much of his essays is making fun of people, making fun of how society operates. Maybe it makes sense then that a school like Cheltenham wouldn't want their students reading this. In girls' schools, order, routine, structure, hierarchy was so important. Is the concern that reading pieces of social criticism like this will encourage like an uprising among the student body? I don't know. It's good writing. If you're wanting to encourage critical thinking amongst young people, then this feels like a good book to read. And if your concern is that the person is impressionable, then surely it's good to read this, because if you're impressionable, your brain is moldable, and so you're able to teach critical thinking through books like this. So definitely should not have been banned. The one that I am reading as well is called On Reason and Imagination. It appeared to him, although an unfounded one, that on the contrary, the flowers often concealed the fruit beneath them, and the ornaments of style were rather a hindrance than an advantage to the sentiments they were meant to set off. I'm going to finish this. I do love reading Hazlitt. Would recommend, even if Victorian teenagers were not allowed to read this. In this essay, Hazlitt is arguing that experience is much more important than book learning when it comes to education, and so perhaps that also is at odds with what the school system is doing. Book 2 is Measure for Measure by William Shakespeare. So Shakespeare was recommended for teenagers to read. He was an important part of a literary education. However, Measure for Measure was deemed controversial. It was actually even cut from the 1632 second folio of Shakespeare. It was also not in the Family Shakespeare, first published in 1807 by Thomas and Henrietta Bowdler. This was a collection of 20 Shakespeare plays that could be read in the home. Hey Google, can you please play Spotify?
Sure, playing Spotify.
In the intro to the Family Shakespeare, Henrietta says her goal is to remove everything that could give offence to the religious and virtuous mind, and take out the many speeches in which Shakespeare has been tempted to purchase laughter at the price of decency. She says her intention is to create a collection of Shakespeare which can be, quote, placed in the hands of young persons of both sexes, and Measure for Measure was not deemed appropriate for them. I've just started reading Measure for Measure in my absolutely stunning first folio facsimile. I've just read Act 1, Scenes 1 and 2, and I mean, there's some scandal to it, but nothing unusual for Shakespeare or early modern theatre in general. I feel like they liked a good bit of scandal. There's adultery in the second scene, which maybe is quite early for adultery, but also not. I'm yet to see exactly why this one was quite so controversial, but I really like it. Like the wordplay in the second scene, at the beginning of the second scene, Lucio and the gentleman, is brilliant. It's very witty. It's fun when a play recognises that it's using language. I'm now up to Act 2, Scene 1, and I can kind of see now why this play was deemed particularly controversial. Although it's really not much more bawdy than other Shakespearean comedies, most of them are, and most early modern theatre is. The play is basically about premarital sex, and I think that's why it's been banned. But then the thing is, like, the general premise is that it's been outlawed, so people are being sentenced to death. I suspect the issue was that we're encouraged to take the side of, like, the ordinary people who are at threat of being killed. Maybe less about plot and more about where our allegiances are set to lie. I mean, it is quite funny. I don't really like Shakespeare's comedies as much. It's good, and there are some good lines in this. Oh, and as I was reading, I was just adding in page flags of quotes and sections that were particularly interesting. Did have a slight interlude because my grandma popped round for about an hour, so I was chatting with her, but now I'm going to get back to reading Measure for Measure, and I'm just about to start Act 3. Whilst my invention, hearing not my tongue, anchors on Isabel, heaven in my mouth, as if I did but only chew his name. Wow, the Duke is a wise guy. I'm sorry, I love this section. Maybe they just really didn't like that this wasn't in iambic pentameter. Maybe that's why it was banned. Honestly, it's so much fun reading this from the first folio. This was my main birthday present, and it's the first time I've read a full play from it. I've just finished, and yes, it's rude, but also, like, I don't think it's that much more scandalous than another Shakespeare play. Book number 3, Kidnapped by R.L. Stevenson. And this was banned for a very particular reason. R.L. Stevenson was decidedly an author for boys. I was going to read Treasure Island, but I don't own a copy of that. I'm not a big fan of this era of boys literature. It's so problematic. Possibly echoes of sensationalism here. This too with the mentions of murder. I'm on chapter 11. I'm actually going to go on a run now because I'm really in the mood, because I've been sitting still for quite a long time. I just want to move a little bit, and then hopefully my concentration will be a bit better, because I am starting to lose focus. I mean, this isn't the kind of book I really like. I don't really like this era of boys fiction at all. Back outside, and I've had a cold shower, so I'm not feeling quite so overheated as I did. I've also got a peanut butter chocolate smoothie, which is so good. I'm going to power through and read the rest of this now. Already this. Definitely inappropriate for sensitive teenage girls. The floor was covered with broken glass and in a horrid mess of blood which took away my hunger. Just totally inappropriate for the recommended audience. Chapter 87, we're getting to him alone, stranded on an island. Just like children's serialised fiction today, there are set tropes and a set format for this kind of literature, and one of those is definitely being stranded on an island. I will say too, I really do not know much about this era of boys fiction, so approaching this kind of blind. So the main thing I noticed, which I have already said, is the sensationalist nature of this book and boys fiction in general. Obviously Alice in Wonderland was written for a much younger female audience, but though there's some uncanniness in that book, this is filled with so much more gore and action. I've just finished Kidnapped. It's about 5:30. I'm now going to get started with the book that I'm most excited to read today, which is The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, which is a sensationalist novel. Women were notoriously discouraged from reading sensationalist literature, but especially teenage girls, because it was thought too much for a delicate disposition. Because of course sensationalist literature, especially things like the Penny Dreadfuls, were all about eliciting a reaction, a strong emotional response, which was just too much for women to handle. So I'm gonna read that. I'm actually already halfway through it. I started it like 2 years ago and I never finished it. And let's see if it's too much for my delicate female condition. So here's book 3, and as I say, I had already started it, but I did go back to the beginning because I really could not remember what had happened, and I'm glad that I did. I forgot just how good this book is. I just got to the end of another one of the parts, and we're about to go into like a diary extract from Marion. It's just so readable. The one thing that I am so aware of though is like, this is deemed sensationalist literature. Wilkie Collins was known for his sensationalism, but it's really not that sensational. I mean, it's really readable, it's really enjoyable, and it's very fast paced, but the fact that this was deemed sensational really puts into perspective just how kind of overstimulating current content is, because if you compare the content of this to so many action films or just kind of like even like kids shows today, it's really not as intense, and it just like emphasizes how insensitive we have become to like that level of drama, that level of sensation. It's just quite interesting thinking about how our sensitivity culturally has maybe shifted since the Victorian period. Anyway, I'm gonna go get some dinner. After dinner I kept on reading and it remained just as good. Being, however, nothing but a woman, condemned to patience, propriety and petticoats for life, I must respect the housekeeper's opinions and try to compose myself in some feeble and feminine way. So yes, she's ascribing to feminine ideals, but she is not happy about it. Do not expect to finish this by the end of the day because it's 700 pages, but I'm going to try and read maybe like another 300 before the end of the day. It is starting to get a little bit spooky. It's a bit vampiric. It's really reminding me of Dracula, and I think I'm gonna go outside and read for a bit because it's a really nice evening and it's not quite so hot anymore. Nonsense. What have women to do with business? I tell you again, you can't understand it. As she's told to sign the document. You know, this really reminds me of the tenant of Wildfell Hall. Perhaps Wilkie Collins was inspired by Acton Bell. Anyway, I spent the rest of my evening enjoying this book. I did not finish it. I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you have more than just a productive week.